Hello and welcome to Marker Development Video 2. In this video I'm going to be talking about the specific comments section of the evaluation form that markers complete as part of marking a student essay. Hopefully on your screen on the left you'll see an example of some problematic marker comments that Jan Molt supplied from me from the university, and on the right you'll see my attempt at revising those comments. Before I go into some specific commentary, what I wanted to do is just give some general advice regarding completing this part of the marker evaluation form. The first thing that's worth saying is that the university expects markers to produce about, at a minimum, 2 pages of content and at a maximum 4 pages of content for the students. 1 page is the general comments, and then the remainder represents the specific comments. So this is going to be the bulk of feedback that you give to students, at least half. I tend to write closer to 4 pages than to 2 pages in my own feedback. And one thing that you want to do with the specific comments is to make sure that you comment on every substantial section of a student's paper. So sometimes students will go into quite deep subsections, and I realize that my comments are going to be going over the total space available to me as a marker. So what I do in those cases is I'll summarize my comments on specific subsections, and I'll make sure that it's obvious to the student which sections I'm referring to by including that information in the section numbers column on the feedback form. Hopefully you can see an example of that in front of you now. The second point that I think it's worth making is that this is the substantive evaluative feedback that students will be receiving from the university. So I feel that, and the university feels that it's really important to engage with the content of students' essays. And so if there are some formatting errors, you can certainly point them out. But one mistake to try to avoid is pointing out the same error in several different places, because that can understandably give students the wrong idea about what their essay, what parameters their essay has been evaluated on. And then finally, I think it's worth noting that the 2 major challenges I tend to face in evaluating students' essays are with quite well done essays. I have to search for how the students could have done better. And I've spoken to students in the past who have gotten, for example, a 72, a 73, and a 74 on their first 3 module papers, and they want to know how to get a 78 on their later module papers. And so when papers are really good, I try to speak to that audience and let them know, of course, where they've gone right, and then also, where possible, where they could have done even better. And then the other group of papers that I find it a real challenge to mark are papers that are disappointing or have some severe weaknesses. And it's important to try to, of course, point out where the weaknesses in the papers are, but at the same time to be supportive and to let the students know what they've done right, even though their papers have some weaknesses. And I think that's a good jumping off point to get into the specific comments that I'll be talking about today. So rather than read to you, what I'm going to do is give you a chance to pause the video and read each column one at a time, and then I'll offer some commentary. So the first part, the first row, the front matter row, there isn't very much to talk about on the left, but what I wanted to say is in all of the marking that I do, I try to note for the students whether what they've included in the introduction, in the part of their paper before the introduction in the front matter, is complete or not. In particular, every batch of marking that I do, at least one student seems to not reproduce the text of the essay question. And particularly since that's been a problem in the past, I go to the student handbook and make sure to copy and paste the text of the question. And I note for the students that that hasn't been counted, that omission hasn't been counted against them in the marking, but I do want to make sure that they know exactly which essay question text I've used for my marking. Next, I'm going to move on to row 1, so if you'd like to pause the video to read, please go ahead. So, on the left, you can see that the marker has negatively evaluated the student's introduction, but I feel that while the negative evaluation is legitimate, the marker's used quite strong and direct confrontational language, which could be misconstrued by the student as kind of an attack on the student's personality, rather than a commentary on the essay. So what I've tried to do on the right was to couch the same negative evaluative language in a little bit more sensitive prose so that it's still obvious to the student where they've gone wrong, but hopefully it's also apparent that I'm commenting on the contents of the essay and not evaluating them as a person. Next, I'll move on to 2, so if you'd like to pause the video, please go ahead. The problem with 2 on the left is that it's summarizing the contents of that particular section, but it's not offering any evaluation. So the student doesn't know what they've done right or what they've done wrong in their paper. What I've done on the right is keep the summary so that the student knows that I've read the contents of the section, and then I've included some evaluative text in order to let them know where the paper's gone right. And I'm making this up. I don't have access to the paper itself, but assuming that the section's well written, hopefully a student would have done those things. Next, I'm going to move on to 3, so if you'd like to pause the video, please go ahead. The problem on the left, there's kind of 2 main issues. One is that bullet point 1 and 3 are referring to the same error that the students made. And so, as a student, if you notice the marker pointing out the same problem twice, you might feel that you've been docked marks for the same error 2 times. So rather than note the same problem multiple times, what I've done on the right was summarize the first 2 bullet points into 1 paragraph. And then the middle bullet point offers a legitimate criticism of the paper and the student's presentation of testing, but the language in general on the left is quite direct and confrontational. So what I've also tried to do on the right is to couch the evaluative language in a little bit more sensitive prose. Next, I'm going to talk about 3.4 and 4. These are the only 2 that are thematically consistent. Please don't think that 1, 2, 3, and then this 3.4 and 4 are all from the same paper. We didn't want to single out any particular person, so these are kind of a hodgepodge of comments from different papers. But here what you have is some thematic consistency between 3.4 and 4. So if you want to pause the video to read, please go ahead and read both rows. What you can see with 3.4 is that the marker is summarizing the contents of the paper but not offering an evaluation of those contents. With 4, there's a little bit of evaluation, but the marker's primarily evaluating sections earlier in the paper. So what I've done on the right is, in 3.4, I've tried to add an element of evaluation. And then in 4, I moved the comment about the engaging read to the beginning of the evaluation, and then I've pointed out some other weaknesses in the paper after that. That's a very standard genre strategy in evaluative texts, for example, journal reviewing, to say where this person has gone right and then to point out some weaknesses in the prose. Next, I'm going to move on to 8, so if you'd like to pause the video to read, please go ahead. So with 8, on the left, you can see that the marker is a bit disappointed with some of what the student's done. The student's saying that teachers should do what they can to increase motivation, but hasn't described what teachers can do. However, I feel that the marker's been a bit opaque regarding what the weaknesses in the paper are. So what I've tried to do on the right is to expand those comments in order to make it more obvious to the student how they could have written that essay better. And then on the left, you'll notice that the comments end, but on the right, you also have references and then a note about the appendix. One of the requests from the University of Birmingham is to comment on every substantive section of a student paper, which includes the references and the appendices. Obviously, you don't want to spend a lot of time commenting on these, but I try to give one sentence or so of feedback for each of those to let the students know that I've seen them and acknowledge their presence in the paper. That's all for this video. In the next video, I'm going to discuss key points to bear in mind for the next piece of work. And then in video 4, I'll go back up to the top of the evaluation form and talk about the general comments. So the videos will follow the same order in which I evaluate papers when I do my marking. Thank you very much for listening.